The sun was a white-hot coin nailed to the endless New Mexico sky, and beneath it rode the last son of a vanished people. Taza, of the Chiricahua Apache, guided his weary horse across a land that shimmered like a sea of glass. The air trembled, the rocks bled color, and the horizon never came closer no matter how long he rode. It was the kind of country that forgot men quickly. Once Taza had been a son, a brother, a scout whose laughter echoed through cedar canyons. Now he was little more than a ghost in the skin of a man. The white soldiers had come years ago, and with them came fire. His village had burned in a single night, homes, drums, and dreams all rising into the black sky like sparks seeking stars. Since then he had ridden alone, following no trail except the one memory carved in his chest. The desert did not pity him. It stripped him to what was necessary: muscle, bone, breath. He hunted with patience, drank from pools that shimmered between stones, and slept where the coyotes dared not come. To others, this land was cruel. To Taza, it was honest. The desert never lied about what it could take from you. When he looked upon the mesas at dusk, he sometimes imagined he could still hear the voices of his people carried on the wind. His mother's song, his father's low chant before the hunt, the laughter of children who would never grow old. He would close his eyes and breathe it in, letting grief move through him like smoke. It never left, but it no longer blinded him either. He had learned to live with pain as one might live beside a shadow. Every morning he painted a single white line across his cheek with clay, an old sign of remembrance. Not vengeance, just memory. Then he would speak a few quiet words to the spirits before mounting his horse again. To live was to honor them, he believed. To forget would be to die a second death. Yet beneath his calm, loneliness coiled like a snake waiting for warmth. He had seen no one for months except soldiers in the distance and the bones of travelers swallowed by the desert. Sometimes he wondered whether the Creator had left the world entirely. The stars at night were bright enough to wound the eye, but even they felt far away, cold and watchful. That morning, the wind carried a strange scent, smoke, not of mesquite or cedar, but of something foreign. He reined in his horse and lifted his face to the breeze. It came from the east, faint but unmistakable. Campfire. He listened, hearing nothing but the steady breath of the land. Curiosity tugged at him, yet so did caution. The world had taught him that most fires belonged to men who brought trouble. Still, a flicker of restlessness stirred inside him. Perhaps it was loneliness pretending to be bravery. He turned his horse toward the distant scent and rode until the sun dipped low, painting the cliffs with blood-red light. As twilight gathered, he found what remained of a wagon, shattered wheels, a broken axle, and the faint prints of boots leading away into the arroyos. The sand was littered with pieces of cloth and a single silver locket glinting among the dust. Taza crouched beside it, turning it in his fingers. Inside was a tiny drawing of a woman with her hair braided neatly over one shoulder. The clasp was still warm from the sun. He rose slowly, scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, someone had lost this. Someone alive, perhaps. The thought pulled at him with quiet force. He could have ridden on, left the mystery to the coyotes and the wind. But a memory stopped him. His sister's face, frightened and alone on the night their village burned. He had not been there to save her. Maybe this was a chance, however small, to answer that old wound. He gathered the locket, looped it around his neck for safekeeping, and led his horse onward into the gathering dusk. The desert changed its colors as night fell, purple, then indigo, then black. Stars bloomed above him like embers reborn. The air cooled, and the wind whispered against the cliffs in a language older than men. Taza did not know that the faint trail he followed would lead him not to death, but to something far rarer in his world, a heart still capable of love. He only knew that he could no longer ignore the call of the unknown. For the first time in years, the loneliness within him shifted, not vanishing but making room for something new. It was not hope yet, only the fragile beginning of it. He whispered into the night, "Show me what remains." And the desert, in its ancient patience, answered with silence. By nightfall, the desert turned into a world of shadows. The wind rose like a restless spirit, sweeping sand in low, snarling gusts that bit into skin and eyes. Taza wrapped his blanket tighter around his shoulders, guiding his horse through a narrow ravine. The sky above flashed with distant lightning, not enough to promise rain, only to tease it. He had tracked the faint footprints for hours, watching as they grew weaker and more erratic. Whoever had walked this path was losing strength. He noticed the occasional mark where a hand had touched stone for balance, and once, the smallest smear of blood, already dried by the heat. A storm was coming. He could smell it now, iron, dust, and the faint sweetness of mesquite stirred by the wind. The horse snorted uneasily. Taza clicked his tongue softly, pressing onward. When the first drops of rain hit the parched earth, they hissed like whispers of ghosts. The storm came fast, sweeping across the plains in a wall of brown fury. Visibility vanished in seconds. Taza dismounted and pulled his horse behind a cluster of rocks, wrapping the reins around a juniper root. He crouched low, shielding his face with his arm, and that was when he heard it, a voice, faint, a cry carried by the wind. He froze. The desert often played tricks on the ears. The voice of the storm could sound like anything, even a memory. But then it came again, closer this time, a hoarse plea barely audible. Help. Taza rose, his heart quickening. He moved through the veil of dust and rain, following the sound. His eyes narrowed against the stinging wind until he saw a shape on the ground, small, motionless. A woman half buried in sand and tangled skirts. He knelt beside her, turning her gently. Her face was pale, lips cracked from thirst, hair matted and braided down her back in the settler's fashion. Her breathing was shallow but steady. In one hand she still clutched a small piece of fabric, the torn sleeve of a man's coat perhaps. Her other wrist was bruised, and her dress was streaked with the red dust of miles walked under the sun. She stirred faintly at his touch, whispering words he couldn't understand. Her accent was different, soft, Eastern, maybe Virginian. Her voice cracked on the single word she managed, water. Taza unfastened the small hide pouch at his side and let a few drops fall onto her lips. She swallowed weakly. The rain began to fall harder, soaking both of them as the desert turned to a smear of mud and grit. They couldn't stay there. He lifted her easily. She was light as a bird, and carried her toward the shallow cave he'd used before during monsoon season. His horse followed, head low, tail whipping against the rain. Inside the cave, the air was cool and dry. He laid her down near the wall, built a small fire, and stripped away her wet shawl to let her breathe. As the flames took hold, Taza finally saw her clearly. She was young, younger than he'd first thought, her skin pale as sandstone and her eyes fluttering beneath closed lids. A few freckles scattered across her cheeks like faint stars. Around her neck hung a thin chain, but the locket was gone. He touched the one he'd found earlier, feeling the same shape under his fingers. He sat across from her, silent, watching the firelight dance across her face. She was no spirit, no enemy, just another soul lost in a land that devoured the careless and the proud alike. When she woke some hours later, the storm had passed. The fire burned low and the scent of wet sage filled the cave. Her eyes opened wide in confusion and fear as she saw him, tall, dark, painted, and silent as stone. She tried to sit up but winced, clutching her side. "Where am I?" she croaked. Taza didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure she would understand his words. Instead, he poured a little more water into a wooden bowl and pushed it toward her. "You live," he said finally, his English rough, accented but steady. She blinked at him, startled. "You speak English?" "A little," he replied. "You are far from your people." She glanced toward the cave mouth where the wind still moaned softly through the rocks. "My father's wagon," she whispered. "We were attacked. I ran. I didn't know where I was going." Taza nodded slowly. He had already guessed as much. "You safe now," he said, voice low. "Rest." For a long time she said nothing. Then, as exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep, she murmured without opening her eyes, "Who are you?" He stared into the fire. The flames painted his scars gold. "No one," he said quietly. "Just the last of my kind." Outside, the desert began to breathe again, cool, vast, and silent. Inside the cave, two strangers from different worlds listened to the same heartbeat of the earth. Neither yet knew how deeply their paths had just intertwined. When dawn came, the desert was reborn. The storm had washed the world clean. Dunes reshaped air cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Thin ribbons of mist curled along the ravine where Taza's fire still burned low. From outside the cave came the steady drip of rainwater from the rocks, a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. Taza stirred the ashes with a stick, adding a few pieces of dry mesquite. He moved quietly as one long practiced in silence. His guest was still asleep, curled beneath his horse blanket, her face half hidden by strands of golden hair that had slipped from the braid during the night. She looked fragile in the morning light, a creature of another world. The settlers built their homes from timber and iron. His people had built theirs from sky and dust. He watched her for a long time, studying the sharpness of her cheekbones, the faint tremble of her lashes when she dreamed. Somewhere in her face he saw fear and strength tangled together like roots. When she woke, the first thing she did was reach for her throat, the locket. Her hand found nothing but skin, and panic flashed in her eyes. "Where is it?" she whispered, sitting up abruptly. Taza reached into the pouch at his belt and placed the silver locket in her palm. "Found near broken wagon," he said. "Yours?" She nodded, clutching it to her chest. Her shoulders softened and she looked at him, really looked for the first time. The man before her was unlike anyone she had ever seen. His hair was long, bound with a strip of leather. His skin was sun-browned, his eyes sharp as obsidian. Across one cheek ran a white streak of paint. Not war paint, but something quieter. Memory, perhaps, she swallowed, unsure. "You saved me." He didn't answer right away. "Storm did not kill you," he said simply. "I only carried you." She almost smiled at that, though her lips still trembled. "Then I owe the desert my thanks." "The desert takes more than it gives," he replied. "You are lucky." He handed her a small piece of dried meat and a gourd of water. She ate slowly, her body remembering hunger before her mind did. When she finished, she spoke again, her voice low and cautious. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield." "Taza," he said after a pause, tapping his chest. "Of the Chiricahua." Her brow furrowed. "Apache?" He nodded once. Fear flickered across her face, instinctive, learned, but only for a heartbeat. She studied him again, realizing that if he had meant her harm, he'd had 100 chances to show it already. Instead, she saw calm strength and the strange gentleness in the way he had folded her blanket. They sat in silence for a time. Outside, the storm had left pools of rain shimmering between stones. A hawk circled high above the canyon rim. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "I was traveling west with my father. We were going to start a ranch near the river." Her eyes darkened. Men came out of nowhere. Bandits, maybe soldiers, I couldn't tell. My father told me to run. I did. Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. "I've been walking ever since. I thought I'd die out there." Taza listened without interruption. When she finished, he said quietly, "The land can be cruel to the lost." Her gaze lifted to meet his. "Then how do you live in it?" "I do not fight it," he said. "I listen." The words lingered in the cave's hush, and something in her eyes softened. She looked toward the horizon visible beyond the cave mouth, vast, shimmering, endless. "It's beautiful," she said, "even when it tries to kill you." Taza's mouth curved in something that might have been a smile. "That is how beauty is born." The morning passed in slow rhythm. He showed her how to drink safely from rainwater caught in stone hollows, how to read the tracks of animals along the wet sand. She listened intently, repeating the names of things in his language, Tusa for rabbit, Cheish for sun. He corrected her gently, patient as though teaching a child. When she stumbled over the sound, she laughed, the first real laugh since he'd met her. The sound startled him. It was bright, alive, like a spark in dry tinder. For a moment, it made him forget the years of silence behind him. That night, as the fire crackled and shadows danced along the cave walls, Eleanor turned to him. "You must think me foolish, running into the desert with no idea where I was going." Taza shook his head. "You are still here? That is wisdom." She looked at him curiously, almost smiling. "You speak as though the earth listens to you." He glanced toward the open sky beyond the cave. "Sometimes," he said, "when it wants to." They sat quietly after that. The distance between them, of blood, language, and world, began to shrink, not through words, but through silence shared without fear. Outside, the desert hummed beneath the stars. Inside, two strangers began to feel less like strangers. The desert turned golden that evening. After days of storm and silence, the sky opened wide, painted in fire, bands of orange, rose, and copper stretching beyond the canyon's rim. Eleanor stood outside the cave, watching the last rays fade against the sandstone. The wind lifted strands of her hair, tugging them loose from the braid that had survived the storm. Taza was nearby, kneeling by the small stream that had formed after the rains. He was cleaning his knife, the movement steady and careful. The light caught the edge of the blade, flashing like a sliver of the setting sun. He felt her eyes on him before he heard her steps approach. "You never seem to rest," she said softly, "even when the world goes still." Taza rose, wiping the knife on his sleeve. "Rest is for those with walls to guard them. The desert watches even when it sleeps." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You speak as if the desert were alive." "It is," he said, glancing toward the horizon. "It listens, it tests, it forgives. Sometimes." She studied him for a long moment, her hands fidgeting with the end of her braid. "You really believe that?" "I know it," he replied. Then, after a pause, "It is the only way to survive." There was no boasting in his voice, and only a calm certainty that came from years of listening to the earth instead of men. Eleanor found herself wanting to understand that kind of peace. Back home, her world had been ruled by rules, fences, and names on paper. Out here, everything felt raw and real, including the man standing before her. As the last light dimmed, the air cooled. They returned to the cave where the fire's glow painted their faces in amber. Eleanor sat cross-legged, combing dust from her hair with her fingers. The braid had loosened completely now, the strands falling like threads of pale gold. She sighed. "My mother used to braid it every morning," she said quietly. "Said it kept me safe. She'd tell me, 'Never let the world see your hair undone unless you trust who's watching.'" Her laugh was soft, half-hearted. "Seems foolish now," Taza shook his head. "Not foolish," he said. "In my people's ways, hair is memory. What it touches, it keeps." He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, she saw something unguarded in his eyes, not the coldness of a survivor, but the warmth of someone who still believed in the unseen. The fire cracked between them. Outside, coyotes called to one another in the distance. The night was vast, yet within the cave, it felt as if the world had folded itself into a smaller, quieter place. Eleanor hesitated. Her fingers brushed her braid again. Then she spoke the words almost to herself, though he heard them clearly. "Undo my braid first." Taza's head lifted. His expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe even fear. He understood what those words meant, even if her people used different customs. Trust. Surrender. A letting go of the walls that guarded the heart. He moved slowly, crossing the small space between them. His hand hovered near her shoulder, rough and hesitant. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded, eyes steady. "You saved my life. I should at least trust you with a braid." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Taza reached forward, his fingers brushing against the strands. Her hair was soft, catching the firelight as if holding embers within it. He worked carefully, untying the small leather band, letting each section fall free. The motion was simple, but his hands trembled slightly as though touching something sacred. When the last twist unraveled, her hair spilled over her shoulders, gleaming in the low light. She exhaled slowly, eyes closing, and for the first time in days, the tension in her body disappeared. Taza sat back on his heels, wordless. Something in him shifted, a small, silent quake deep inside the part of him that had long turned to stone. He had touched countless things, weapons, earth, ashes, but never something that felt so alive, so undeserving of harm. She looked up at him, smiling softly. "There, now it's undone." He nodded once, voice rough. "It is beautiful." The words surprised him as much as they did her. Outside, the moon rose, pale and full, casting silver light across the desert. Within the cave, a new kind of silence filled the space. Not the silence of fear or emptiness, but of understanding, fragile, unspoken, and real. For Taza, something long buried stirred awake. Not desire, not even longing, but a memory of connection. Of being seen not as a ghost or warrior, but as a man. He stood, adding another branch to the fire, then looked back at her. "Sleep now," he said softly. "Tomorrow we find your people." She nodded, still holding the braid's loose end in her hand. "And if we don't?" Taza gazed into the flames. "Then the desert will show us where to go." As she lay down, her hair spread across the blanket like spilled sunlight. He turned away to keep watch by the cave's mouth, but his mind did not return to duty. It stayed with the quiet words that had changed the shape of the night, words that would echo in his memory long after the fire died. Undo my braid first. The next morning, the desert was a mirror of calm. No wind, no sound but the distant hum of cicadas and the slow trickle of rainwater drying in the canyons. The storm had passed completely, leaving the land scrubbed clean as if creation itself had started over. Eleanor woke to the smell of mesquite smoke and the soft shuffle of movement. Taza was crouched by the fire, roasting thin strips of rabbit meat over glowing coals. He moved with unhurried precision, every motion deliberate, silent. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes were kind. "You should eat," he said simply. She sat up, brushing the sleep from her eyes. Her hair, unbraided from the night before, fell around her face in uneven waves. It caught the morning light like the surface of a river. She reached to gather it but paused. Something in her made her stop. For the first time, she left it loose. Taza noticed but said nothing. He handed her the cooked meat, wrapped in a broad mescal leaf. She accepted it with a small nod. Their fingers brushed for an instant, and though neither spoke of it, the contact lingered like a spark that refused to fade. After breakfast, they packed what little they had and began walking north, following the sun. His horse carried their supplies, moving patiently behind. Taza led the way, tracing a path through dry washes and scrubland. Eleanor followed close, her boots sinking in the soft red sand. Hours passed in silence, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind that filled the space between two people who no longer needed to fill it with words. At times she would glance at him, the way he moved almost soundless, every sense attuned to the land. He seemed to listen to the world instead of just seeing it. Once, when she stumbled over a rock, he turned before she even cried out, steadying her by the arm. His hand was warm and steady, his grip strong enough to ground her but gentle enough not to frighten. "You walk like river water," he said, half smiling. She blinked. "Is that good or bad?" "Both," he replied. "River never stops, but it forgets where it began." She laughed softly. "Then maybe I'm finally learning from the desert." He nodded once, eyes glinting. Desert teaches what words cannot. That became the rhythm of their days, quiet steps, small exchanges, long silences. When she tired, he would show her how to rest in the shade of rock overhangs. When she grew thirsty, he would cut open a cactus and let her drink from its heart. She learned to read the land by watching him, the tilt of his head, the way he paused before every horizon as though listening for something she could not hear. In turn, she taught him her words, the names of flowers, of stars, of faraway places she had known only through books. He repeated them carefully as if tasting each one. Sometimes she would catch him murmuring them to himself in the quiet hours of dusk, his deep voice shaping the unfamiliar syllables with surprising tenderness. That night, they made camp beside a dry riverbed. The stars above were sharp and endless, their light so bright it painted silver lines on the sand. The fire burned small, flickering gently in the wind. Eleanor sat near it, knees drawn to her chest. Her eyes reflected the flames. Taza sat across from her, sharpening his knife. The rhythmic scrape of stone against steel was oddly soothing. When he stopped, the desert was so still that she could hear her own heartbeat. "Taza," she said quietly, "do you ever wish you weren't alone?" He looked up slowly. "Alone?" He considered the word. "The land is never empty. Only men forget how to listen." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You really don't talk much, do you?" He shrugged. "Words are arrows. Use too many and you miss the mark." Her laugh broke the quiet again, soft, real, and needed. The sound made something inside him ease, the way sunlight warms cold stone. For a while they sat without speaking. The stars burned brighter. A coyote called far away, and the wind brushed gently against the sage. Eleanor leaned back, her hair spread behind her like pale fire in the sand. "Sometimes," she whispered, "silence says more than anything else." Taza's eyes met hers across the flickering light. "Yes," he said softly. "That is why I trust it." The firelight shimmered between them, not as a barrier but as a bridge. No promises were spoken. None were needed. He reached down and picked up a strand of her loose hair that had drifted near the fire. Carefully, he moved it away before the flame could catch it. Their hands brushed again, and this time neither pulled back. For a moment, The world outside ceased to exist. No soldiers, no blood, no tribes or borders. Only two souls speaking in the oldest language there was. The silence between breaths. When she finally lay down to sleep, the last thing she saw was his silhouette against the stars, still awake, still watching. She realized then that he didn't just guard her from danger, he guarded the peace that had finally found them. And for the first time since the storm, she felt safe. Not because she was hidden, but because she was seen. By the fourth day, the desert's peace began to feel almost like forgiveness. The days were hot but mercifully calm, and the nights brought wind soft as breath. Eleanor's cheeks, once pale, now held the faint color of sun. Her steps had grown surer. She no longer asked how far they had to go. She simply followed. Taza noticed the change but said nothing. She moved quietly now, listening when he listened, pausing when he did. He could sense that the land was beginning to accept her, the way it accepted few outsiders. That, in itself, felt like a miracle. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small ridge overlooking a dried-out riverbed littered with animal tracks. Below, the remains of an old fire pit caught Taza's eye. He crouched, fingers brushing the ash. Fresh, not older than 2 nights, his jaw tightened. "Men were here," he said. Eleanor froze. "What kind of men?" He looked at the prints. Heavy boots, 4, maybe 5 riders. One horse limped. "Soldiers," he said at last. "Or bandits. Maybe both." A shadow passed over his face, one she hadn't seen since the storm. The look of a man remembering too much. "Will they come back?" she asked. He didn't answer directly. "We keep moving." They descended from the ridge and followed the canyon floor, the air thick with the scent of creosote. The sun began to drop behind the mesas, turning the cliffs crimson. The silence between them was different now, no longer peaceful but alert, taut as a bowstring. Eleanor could feel it too. Every rustle of brush made her heart jump. She wanted to speak, to ask how close the danger was, but something in Taza's stillness stopped her. He was listening to the world again, and the world, she could tell, was whispering warnings. As darkness fell, they made camp in the shelter of a split boulder. Taza kept the fire small, hidden from the open plain. The stars came out sharp and countless. Eleanor sat close to the flames, her knees drawn up, watching him check his rifle with calm precision. "Do you know them?" she asked finally. "The ones who left that fire?" He looked up. "Maybe, I know their kind." "You fought them before?" "Yes." His tone carried no pride, only memory. "Long ago, when my people still had villages." She hesitated. "The ones who burned them?" He nodded once, gaze fixed on the rifle barrel as he wiped it clean. "Men who came with papers and orders. They said it was the law of their world. We buried ours beneath it." The fire snapped, throwing shadows across his face, and the kind that told stories without words. Eleanor felt a chill despite the warmth. She had heard tales in towns back east, of raids, of Apache warriors, of battles in the night. But none of those stories spoke of men like this, quiet, wounded, still human. She reached out and touched his arm. "You don't have to fight anymore," she said gently. "You saved me. You've done enough." Taza looked at her hand but didn't move away. "The desert remembers," he said. "Sometimes it brings the past back to find you." Later, as she tried to sleep, she heard him leave the campfire and walk out into the open night. He stood there for a long time, a dark figure against the stars, listening. The moonlight carved his face into stone. When he finally returned, his expression was grave. "They follow us," he said quietly. "Not far, is maybe a day behind." Eleanor sat up, her breath catching. "Then what do we do?" "We move before dawn, through the high canyons. They will not find that path." She nodded, trusting him completely now. Still, as she lay back down, she could feel her heart pounding. For the first time since the storm, fear crept back into the quiet. Taza didn't sleep. He sat beside the fire, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond its reach. The memories of another fire, years ago, brighter, crueler, burned in his mind. The screams, the smoke, the smell of pine and blood. He had buried it deep, but the scent of danger brought it back like a ghost. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, he woke her with a gentle shake. "Time to go," he said. They climbed into the high rocks as the sun rose, painting the cliffs in red and gold. Below them, far across the valley, a dust cloud stirred, faint but real. Riders. Eleanor looked at him, fear flashing in her eyes. Taza met her gaze, calm as ever. They come, he said, but the desert is with us, and somewhere deep inside, as they disappeared into the labyrinth of stone, he felt a strange peace, not because he was safe, but because for once he wasn't facing the shadows alone. By the time the sun sank behind the cliffs, the desert had changed its face again. The wind rose hot from the south, whispering through the canyons like a warning. The sky darkened, not to black, but to a deep copper red. The moon climbed slowly, round, swollen, and blood-colored. Taza led Eleanor through a narrow gorge where the rock walls rose high on either side, close enough to trap sound. The air felt heavy. His horse moved quietly behind them, hooves muffled by sand. "Will they find us here?" Eleanor whispered. Taza glanced upward. "If they follow the open valley, no. But if they know the canyons like I do, they might." He scanned the cliff edges. The night creatures were restless. A hawk called once, an odd, jarring cry that didn't belong at night. Taza froze. He knew that signal. The soldiers had learned it from Apache scouts long ago. "They are near," he murmured. "Hide," Eleanor's breath caught. He pushed her toward a crevice between the rocks, narrow, shadowed. "Stay," he said. "Do not move until I call." She gripped his arm. "What will you do?" He met her gaze. "End what began long ago." Before she could protest, he was gone, silent as smoke slipping into the red-tinged darkness. The riders came soon after, 5 of them. The faint glint of rifles caught the moonlight as they entered the gorge. Their voices echoed hard and crude. Taza recognized the leader even before he saw the man's face. Lieutenant Brackett, the one who had ordered the burning of his village years ago. The memory struck him with the force of a spear. His mother's cries, the fire swallowing their homes, the smell of horse sweat and gunpowder. He crouched behind a boulder, breathing slowly, watching them pass. Brackett dismounted, scanning the ground. "Tracks," he muttered. "The savage and the girl are close." The word savage landed like an old wound reopened. But this time Taza didn't let anger guide him, only purpose. When the last rider passed his hiding place, Taza moved. A stone struck the canyon wall, the sharp echoing. The horses startled. Brackett turned his head, hand on his gun. That was all the opening Taza needed. He dropped from the rocks above like a shadow given form. His blade caught the first man across the shoulder before he could cry out. Another spun, firing wildly into the dark. The gunshot cracked through the canyon like thunder. Eleanor flinched at the sound from her hiding place. She wanted to run, to help, but Taza's last command echoed in her head. "Stay." The canyon erupted into chaos. The riders shouted, their voices clashing with the echoes of gunfire. Dust filled the air. The red moon glared down like an unblinking eye. Taza moved like a ghost, unseen until too late. He took down a second man, disarming him with a sweep of his rifle butt. But the third caught him across the side with a shot that burned through flesh. He staggered, biting down a cry, then lunged forward again, driven by something beyond pain. Brackett raised his pistol, his voice cutting through the noise. "You again?" "I should have finished your kind years ago." Taza's eyes flashed. "You finished nothing." They met in the open where the moonlight fell brightest. Brackett fired once, missing as Taza darted aside. They closed the distance, man against man, old hatred against old grief. The fight was quick, brutal, wordless. When it ended, Brackett lay still in the sand, his pistol half buried beside him. Taza stood over him, chest heaving, blood staining his shirt. The desert fell silent again. He turned, awing, and there she was. Eleanor had left her hiding place, running toward him, eyes wide with horror and relief. "Taza!" She reached him just as his knees gave out. He caught himself on one arm, wincing. "You're hurt?" "It is nothing," he muttered, but the way he swayed told her otherwise. She pressed her hands against the wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. The moonlight painted her face pale and fierce. "You saved me again," she whispered. He looked at her, through the pain, through the blur of exhaustion, and managed a faint smile. "Not you only," he said, "myself. From the past." She held him until his breathing steadied. Around them, the canyon was littered with stillness. The wind began to move again, carrying away the last traces of smoke and blood. Above, the red moon started to fade, turning white as dawn crept over the horizon. Taza leaned back against the rock, eyes half closed. "It is done," he said softly. "The desert has taken back what it gave." Eleanor brushed his hair from his forehead, her hand trembling. "You'll be all right," she said, voice breaking. "You have to be." He didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on her face. Not as a warrior seeing an ally, but as a man seeing the one thing that had made all the silence worth surviving. "I will," he said at last. "Because you are here." The first light of morning touched them both, and the blood moon melted into the pale sky. What had begun in fire and loss ended in a strange, fragile peace, the kind that only comes after surviving death twice, once in the body and once in the heart. The morning after the battle came quiet and clear, too quiet, almost unreal. The desert, freshly washed by the night wind, seemed to breathe again. The air held the clean scent of mesquite and ash, and the light was gentle, as though the sun itself feared to disturb them. Taza woke slowly. His side throbbed, the wound stiff beneath a bandage of torn cloth and herbs. The sound of water nearby, faint but real, drew him back from the edge of sleep. Eleanor knelt by a shallow spring trickling from between two rocks. She'd found it at dawn, guided by instinct and desperation. Her hands moved with surprising skill, washing the blood from a strip of cloth. Her hair was unbound now, the braid gone, and the golden strands hung loose around her shoulders, bright as morning itself. When she turned and saw him watching, she smiled with relief. "You're awake." He tried to sit up, but she hurried to his side. "Don't move," she said softly. "You lost blood." He obeyed, not out of weakness, but because her voice, calm and certain, carried more power than any command he'd ever known. "How long?" he asked. "Since last night. You fainted before sunrise. I thought—" Her voice caught, but she steadied it. "I thought you might not wake." He studied her face, the sleepless eyes, the streak of dust on her cheek. "You stayed," he said quietly. "Where else would I go?" She replied. "The world out there isn't mine anymore." Something inside him shifted, slow, unfamiliar. He'd spent years building walls against pain, against feeling. Now, one by one, those walls were cracking. Eleanor reached for the damp cloth and began cleaning the wound again. He flinched at first, but she hushed him gently. "It's not deep," she said. "You were lucky." "Luck is for men who expect mercy," he murmured. "I do not." She looked up at him, eyes shining in the soft light. "Then maybe it's time you did." For a moment, silence hung between them, deep, almost holy. The desert stretched around them in every direction, endless and still. "You said once," she began hesitantly, "that the desert remembers. Does it ever forgive?" He looked out toward the horizon where the sand met the sky. "Not often, but sometimes when the wind changes, it forgets for a little while." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then maybe today it forgets." She dipped the cloth in the water again, and this time when she touched his skin, his hand rose, not to stop her, but to hold hers still. His fingers were rough, her palms soft. The contrast startled them both. "I never knew," he said slowly, "what kindness felt like. Not since I was a boy." Her eyes softened. "And I never knew what courage looked like. Not until I met you." The words struck something deep within him, a part of himself he thought had burned away long ago. He looked down as if ashamed of the feeling stirring there, but she reached up and touched his face. Her thumb brushed the corner of his eye, and there it was, a single tear, small but real, cutting through the dust. Eleanor froze. "Taza," he blinked, startled by his own body's betrayal. "I did not mean—" "Don't," she whispered. "Don't hide it. You've carried enough pain for 10 lifetimes. Let something else live there now." The silence that followed was heavy but not lonely. For the first time, Taza didn't feel like a ghost wandering his own land. He felt alive, hurt, human, and free in a way no battle could ever make him. They stayed by the spring all afternoon. She sang softly while tending the fire, an old melody from her childhood, gentle, sad, and strangely hopeful. He listened without speaking, watching the wind move through her hair. When the sun began to fall, she sat beside him and asked, "What will you do when you're strong again?" He thought for a long moment. "I do not know," he admitted. "All my life I fought for ghosts. Maybe now I will learn to live for something else." She smiled, leaning her head lightly on his shoulder. "Then we'll learn together." The desert cooled as evening came and the stars rose once more. The canyon that had been a place of blood became, under the night sky, a cradle of quiet. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, and between the slow rhythm of her breathing and the soft murmur of water, Taza felt a peace he had never known. It wasn't victory. It wasn't salvation. It was simply love, fragile, unexpected, and real enough to make even a warrior believe in beginnings again. 3 days passed, each one gentler than the last. Taza healed slowly. Eleanor's herbs and quiet persistence did what time alone could not. The fever faded, the color returned to his face, and by the 4th morning he stood again, unsteady but alive. They left the canyon behind, climbing into higher country where the air smelled of pine and sage. The land changed color, from the deep red of desert stone to the soft green of hidden meadows. Even the wind seemed new, cooler, carrying the promise of rain. Eleanor walked beside him, her hand sometimes brushing his arm. They spoke little, but their silence had changed. It no longer carried fear, only the comfort of two souls who no longer needed words. By noon they reached a plateau overlooking the endless stretch of the valley below. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and a low rumble rolled across the horizon. Taza stopped, lifting his face toward the sky. He frowned slightly. "Rain," he said, almost in disbelief. Eleanor smiled. "Is that rare here?" He nodded. "The desert waits years for it sometimes. When it comes, everything changes." She tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time for change." He looked at her, the woman who had once trembled at every sound, now standing tall against the coming storm. "You speak like someone who belongs here," he said quietly. "Maybe I do now," she replied. "Maybe this is where I was meant to find myself." A gust of wind swept through the plateau, lifting her unbraided hair like golden fire. Then came the first drop, and cool, clean falling between them. She laughed softly, tilting her face upward as the sky opened. Within moments, the rain came hard, not a gentle drizzle, but a wild, drumming storm that blurred the edges of the world. The parched earth drank greedily. The scent of wet dust rose thick in the air. Eleanor spun in the downpour, her laughter echoing off the cliffs. "It's beautiful," she shouted over the sound of thunder. Taza watched her, and for a moment the years fell away. He wasn't the scarred warrior anymore. He was just a man seeing the world reborn. He stepped forward, slow and unsure, until he stood beside her. "You should find shelter," he said, though his voice was soft. "Not yet," she answered, smiling. "Let it wash everything away first." He hesitated, then did something he hadn't done in years. He let go. The rain drenched them both, cold but alive, and he closed his eyes. The sound filled him, the storm, her laughter, the heartbeat of the earth. When he opened them again, she was looking at him. For a long, breathless moment, neither spoke. The storm had made her hair cling to her face, her lashes dark with water, but her eyes were steady, bright as lightning. "Taza," she whispered, "do you ever think the land feels what we feel?" He looked out at the valley, where rivers were forming in the dry gullies, where flowers would soon bloom again. "Yes," he said at last. "It remembers sorrow, but it never forgets how to live again." Something in his tone made her step closer. "Then maybe we're the same," she said. "Two parts of the same land, broken once, alive now." He reached up, brushing a raindrop from her cheek. "You speak like the wind," he murmured, soft, but strong enough to move mountains. For a while they just stood there. No words, no past, no fear. Only the storm and the warmth between them. The rain softened, falling now in slow silver threads. The world around them glistened, rocks shining, earth steaming, the scent of renewal everywhere. Eleanor leaned her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat beneath the steady rhythm of rain. "What will we do when the sun comes back?" she asked quietly. He thought for a moment. "We will build something that lasts longer than storms." She smiled against him. "Together?" "Together," he said. And when the rain finally ceased, leaving the land shining like glass, the two of them remained standing, the warrior who had forgotten how to feel and the woman who had taught him how again. Behind them, the desert was no longer barren. Tiny blossoms, white and yellow, had already begun to push through the wet earth. Eleanor saw them first and whispered, almost to herself, "The land forgives after all." Taza followed her gaze, then took her hand. "No," he said softly. "It remembers and can still choose his life." They walked on, leaving their footprints in the new mud, the kind that would harden by morning, marking the place where the sky had finally wept, and the desert had bloomed. By the time the rain stopped for good, the desert was no longer the same. The air smelled of new life, of wet earth, pine resin, and the faint sweetness of blooming yucca. The gullies that had been dry channels of dust now carried thin ribbons of water, whispering softly as they wound through the stone. Taza and Eleanor followed one such stream for most of the next day. It led them north, deeper into the high country. Each step felt lighter than the one before, not because the journey was easier, but because for the first time neither of them walked alone. They spoke little. Words had done their work. The silence between them was alive now, full of shared breath and steady rhythm, the kind of silence that asks for nothing and gives everything. When the sun began to fall behind the mesas, the stream widened into a small pool. The surface caught the last of the light and scattered it into ripples of gold. Nearby, a grove of cottonwoods grew close together, their leaves whispering like old friends. Eleanor stopped, turning toward Taza. "Here," she said softly. "This feels right." He looked around. The water, the trees, the open horizon beyond. For the first time since leaving his village years ago, he felt something stir inside that wasn't grief or anger. It was stillness and belonging. He nodded. "Yes," he said. Here, they made camp beside the pool. The night came slow and clear, stars blooming overhead. The moon was pale again, no longer red, no longer heavy, only gentle. Taza built a small fire and Eleanor cooked what little they had left, roasted roots and strips of dried meat. Simple food, but enough. After they ate, she sat by the water's edge, her reflection flickering between the reeds. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if this is what it was all meant for? All the pain, the loss, leading here?" Taza stared into the fire. "I used to believe pain was the only thing that stayed. Now," he looked up at her, his gaze steady and soft. "Now I think maybe love is what the pain was trying to protect." She turned toward him, and for a long time neither looked away. The fire cracked softly between them, and in its light the scars on his hands looked less like wounds and more like marks of having lived. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You said once that the desert remembers. What will it remember of us?" Taza's lips curved faintly. "It will remember that two strangers crossed it and did not die of thirst." She laughed, quiet but full of warmth. "That's a good story." "It is," he said. "And maybe one day the wind will tell it." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. Their fingers intertwined, rough and gentle, different and yet perfectly matched. The fire's glow painted their faces in gold and shadow, and above them the stars seemed to draw closer, as if listening. Later, when the fire burned low, Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder. "What will we do tomorrow?" she asked sleepily. He thought for a moment before answering. "We'll follow the water," he said. "Rivers begin small, but they always find their way home." She smiled at that, half awake, half dreaming. "Then I'll follow you," she murmured, but he shook his head. "No. From now on we follow each other." The wind moved through the cottonwoods, carrying the faint sound of laughter. Hers first, then his. It echoed into the night, blending with the murmur of the newborn stream. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the first dawn of a new season waited. When morning came, they broke camp. The world glittered with dew. Taza filled their flasks from the pool and watched as Eleanor braided her hair again. Not in the tight, careful way she once had, but loose, soft, free. He smiled. "You once said, 'Undo my braid first.'" She looked at him, a spark of playfulness in her eyes. "And you did," he nodded. Maybe that was when everything began. She took his hand, and together they began walking beside the river, two figures small against the vast reborn land. The water shimmered beside them, winding east toward whatever waited beyond sight. Above, a hawk circled, but not as a warning this time, but as a blessing. And so they walked on, the lonely Apache who had forgotten how to love, and the woman who had taught him how to remember, leaving behind no footprints but the ones the rain would soon wash away, carrying their story forward into the earth that had once been barren, now alive again. Because somewhere, far from the world they left behind, the river had begun.